All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. This is a PowerPoint presentation on English parliamentary tradition. Basically, government that England gave the colonies. Go ahead and minimize this here. Okay, how did English ideas about government and trade affect the colonies? All English colonies shared a common English heritage, and that heritage included the idea that citizens had political rights. England also promoted the theory of mercantilism, that colonies existed to benefit their parent country, but some colonists began to question that theory. So think about the project that we worked on, mercantilism. Again, the colonies existed for England. That's why England created the colonies in the first place. But as time went on, people began to question that due to the amount of money that was going back and forth, and more money was going to England and not the colonies. When we go back in time, we'll see that in 1215, English nobles forced King John to sign the Magna Carta, which was the first document to place restrictions on an English ruler's power. The rights listed in the Magna Carta were at first limited to nobles. Over time, the rights were extended to all English citizens. So think back to last year in 7th grade when you learned about the Magna Carta. So this would be the first document that gave rights to people. And King John was reduced from an absolute monarch to sharing some of that power with the nobility. The Magna Carta did three things. It limited the monarch's right to levy taxes. It would at least have to first consult the nobles. It protected the right to property and the right to trial by jury, meaning that the king just couldn't find you, innocent or guilty and then just sentence you to whatever punishment. You had to be tried by a jury of your peers. Parliament, we could see, was made up of the Great Council. Under the Magna Carta, nobles formed the Great Council to advise the king, and this body developed into the Parliament. So at first, this is what it was called. It was a two-house legislature. Two houses mean that there's two bodies that would consult when it comes to making law. So again, it's more people involved in the say. Three-house legislature would be probably too much. It'd be too confusing. The Parliament, or the Great Council, was made up of the House of Lords. That was the nobility. That would be kind of like our modern-day Senate. And then the House of Commons, that was made up of landowners who had the right to vote. And that's based off of our modern-day House of Representatives. Parliament's greatest power was that no monarch could raise taxes without its consent. So a king just couldn't arbitrarily tax in any shape or form. In the 1640s, power struggles between the king and Parliament led to the English Civil War. The two clashed. And these parliamentary forces eventually won the war. They executed the king and they briefly ruled England. In 1660, the monarchy was restored, but Parliament retained its traditional rights. In the 1680s, the Glorious Revolution, Parliament removed King James II from the throne and invited his daughter Mary and her husband William to rule. A condition of their rule, however, was that they signed the English Bill of Rights. So the important thing was that Parliament, they removed the king. They showed that they had more power. And when they did remove and they put James's daughter and her husband on the throne, they said, you have to sign a Bill of Rights. And that would be rights that would protect against any kind of dictatorial government. The English Bill of Rights restated many of the rights granted by the Magna Carta. It upheld habeas corpus and required that Parliament met regularly. So Parliament had to meet. The king couldn't prohibit that. Habeas corpus, you couldn't just be pulled aside and thrown and locked up for no particular reason. Sometimes leaders would do that when they didn't like a person or a group. They just would jail them, and then that's the end of it. You had to be brought to trial. The legal rights that Englishmen had won over the centuries led the colonists to expect a voice in their government. This shouldn't be any kind of surprise here. By 1760, every British colony in North America had a legislature of some kind, although the legislature sometimes clashed with the colonial governors appointed by the king. So, at first, some colonies, when they were first started, had more representative government. Virginia, for example, had the House of Burgesses. But some other colonies, at least at first, were ruled by proprietors or owners. But as it says here, by 1760, 150 years later, there is some definite form of lawmaking that's occurring in each colony. However, the colonial legislatures, most of which were elected, would clash with the colonial governors appointed by the king. So that's another way to put it would be, England versus the colonists. There's just tension in the room. Virginia and Massachusetts. As I just said earlier, Virginia had the House of Burgesses. Massachusetts had its general court. Think of the Puritans. And again, there was, these were elected. So these people took these English traditions and they brought them over to the New World. The British government gave William Penn outright ownership of Pennsylvania. In 1701, the colonists forced Penn to agree that only the General Assembly, not Penn or his council, could make laws, and that the king could overturn laws passed by the General Assembly. So this is going back to the example that, look, at first, not everybody had this complete, political freedom, but over time there would definitely be more election in the colonies. British and colonial governments were similar in some ways, but they had important differences. The king had, inherited executive power by blood. In the colonies, the governor was appointed and served the king, but the colonial legislature paid for that governor. In Parliament, you had the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And the colonial legislatures, you had an upper house or council and then a lower house. So there were some similarities and there were some differences. But the important thing to remember with this is that the colonists in the New World are bringing these English traditions with them. They didn't leave that. Even though mercantilism was very strict, it benefited England way more than the colonies. But the colonists still brought these traditions over. They were English. You would expect them to have these traditions. In the colonies, 50 to 75% of white men could vote. That was way more than in England. That was definitely different. But the following groups could not vote. English women, natives. Natives weren't citizens, and Africans, they weren't citizens either, whether they were free or enslaved. Another important right for American colonists was the freedom of the press. In England, writers who criticized the government were punished, even if what they said was true. But we'll find out that in the colonies, again, writers had more freedom to publish the truth. John Zenger, he was publisher of the New York Weekly Journal. He was charged with libel. That means writing lies, that would criticize the governor. Jurors, by trial by jury, found Zenger not guilty because the articles he published were based on facts. So even though he was critical, he wasn't punished. And that's a part of our modern-day Bill of Rights in our government, that the press can definitely print what's true. The Zenger case helped establish the principle that a democracy depends on well-informed citizens. So people have to know what the government is doing and be able to think about their actions. And the press has to have the freedom to be able to report that. And again, their job, the press, that is, to keep the public informed. And again, we recognize that in our First Amendment as a basic American liberty. While the colonists maintained some important rights, they felt burdened by Britain's economic policies. Under the theory of mercantilism, colonies existed in order to enrich their parent country. That was the same whether it was a Spanish colony, French. That was mercantilism. In 1651, the English Parliament passed the first of several navigation acts designed to funnel the colonists' wealth to England. There are some pros and cons of the navigation acts. Some pros would be that there was a market for their goods, a booming shipbuilding industry in New England. Some of the cons, though, would be that they definitely favored English merchants. The colonists thought they could make more money if they could trade with others, and it encouraged smuggling. All right, feel free to refer back to this should you need to. Thanks for listening.